One of the questions we get most frequently while developing Empire at War Expanded is why the mod isn't made available for versions of Star Wars Empire at War that aren't the Steam version. The game itself is available through Steam, on Disk, or on GOG, so why haven't we released more recent versions of the mod for all three? The quick answer here is because the Steam version of the game itself has had several very important updates that the other two versions never received. We'll go into exactly what that means in a minute, but that also raises the question of why the official game hasn't received those updates for other versions. I honestly have no good information on that front, unfortunately. When Petroglyph, the developers of Empire at War, and Disney, as the ones holding the publishing rights, have released patches for the game, which has happened every year or two since 2017, they've worked pretty closely with modders to both get help testing and to learn exactly what we'd like to be able to do with the game. We've all tried to ask if updates for the other game versions would be possible, but the answer at least thus far has been no. But when it comes to releasing mods for the older versions of the game, it basically comes down to the fact that if modders were to go back to working on the GOG and Disk versions, there's a lot of very important capabilities we've been taking advantage of for years now, which we wouldn't be able to use. So it would mean developing two versions of any given mod, and the GOG and Disk versions would have to be very, very stripped down, not to mention more frustrating to both work on and play. I understand from the player side it can be frustrating to have to repurchase the game if you already have a Disk or GOG copy, but without the updates the game has received on Steam, I really don't think the Empire at War modding community would be active anymore. The Steam patches really did reinvigorate a game that was dying, so it's not like the alternative reality where they didn't happen would just mean you'd have much better mods for all three copies. It had been years since a lot of the major mods had put out a big release when the first update started coming out in 2017. A lot of teams had started slowly filtering out or disbanding and going to do other things with their lives. So in a perfect world, the GOG and Disk versions would have received the updates as well, but that's not really something modders can control either, so please stop leaving me angry messages about Thrawn's Revenge not being available on GOG or Disk. Some of the changes made by these patches involve fixes for some pretty impactful bugs. For one thing, character tags in XML files have some limits on length before the game just starts crashing on load. These tend to be much larger on Steam, and this was actually even the case before the patches. We used to run into this issue with Thrawn's Revenge with the Galactic Conquest especially, so in the early days of the Steam patches when we were still trying to support both GOG and Steam, this meant we would just have to cut the larger Galactic Conquest from the GOG and Disk versions. Shortly after the first patch in 2017, which re-enabled multiplayer, there was another pretty big fix which allowed us to have even bigger Galactic Conquest maps on the Steam version. As the game progressed, eventually some kind of integer limit would be hit, and essentially unique IDs could no longer be assigned to objects. That includes things like planets and units. So once this happened, once a certain amount had happened in the game would seem like it would freeze. Nothing could be moved, but time would still continue rolling on. We were able to release a utility for this ourselves, which allowed you to load a save file affected by this and fix it by resetting some values. But while it was the only way to address this bug when it happened, it could also sometimes just corrupt the save, so it wasn't a perfect fix. So before Petroglyph fixed this issue directly, it put a significant limit on campaign size and length. If you were playing maps that had like 20 or 30 planets, it was very unlikely to hit it, but if you were even in the 50 planet plus range, you would get more and more likely to have this bug occur at some point within your campaign. The more your strategy went in the direction of turtling, the more likely you would be to hit this limit. It also meant on the design side, you had to try to avoid having factions that relied too much on spamming units. But with the official patches, this has stopped being something we have to try to develop around. At this point, after the first patches, it was still largely a use-at-your-own-risk situation, rather than something that meant it was significantly more difficult to make the mods compatible in at least a basic way between both Steam and other versions. Because the real limit here, at least on the side of developing mods, we don't care that much if you're willing to take the risk that sometimes you might run into bugs. The problem is that we would now have to strip out so much to make two different versions of the mod, one of which we wouldn't even want to play. And the more the patches went on, the more features were added that allowed us to do more flexible things, which would require more stripping out of content to make a GOG version. And by stripping out of content, I don't just mean, we'd have to cut out a unit from the XML code. I mean having to fundamentally change the way certain things are coded, especially in Lua scripting. At that point, you're making two different mods that need to be made and maintained simultaneously for something that's supposed to be a hobby project. But let's go over some of the bigger factors which today separate the GOG and Steam versions. First, something that's a bit more widely known but actually less impactful than you might think, we have a fairly recent development. The game was changed to 64-bit from 32. For the most part, this doesn't actually directly impact mod capability, and if this was the only change, the same mods would generally be compatible for all game versions, just without some of the performance improvements given by the 64-bit patch. I've seen some people bring up the idea that this is why we don't mod the older versions because they're 32-bit, but that's not actually the case. When the game was made 64 bits, we actually had to make 0 changes to make it compatible. Where this does become an issue is actually with a subsequent patch, which allowed things called category masks to use 64-bit fields. This expansion to masks, which not every mod takes advantage of, we're only switching them as of the 0.5 versions I think, allow a bit more flexibility for things like telling the AI which units to use, and they're used in things like determining accuracy against specific targets. They are very handy, but again, this is a fairly recent development. It's not the reason we stopped developing for the GOG or Disk version. The biggest individual category where the patches have made significant changes impacting modders, though, is probably factions. This is another area where even just bug fixes completely changed what the game was capable of. In the GOG and Disk versions currently, if you have more than a certain number of factions coded into the game, either 16 or 17, I can't remember exactly, the game would start crashing in certain situations, particularly in attacks against factions in those slots. 17 may sound like a lot of factions, but it doesn't just mean the playable ones. This includes factions, both non-playable ones and ones that are used for core gameplay purposes like neutral and hostile under the hood. When an object in the game, like a prop, isn't owned by anyone, it's actually owned by a faction called neutral, and that faction counts towards the slot total. For Thrawn's Revenge in particular, this meant we had to cut the Duskin League as a playable faction almost 10 years ago, and we almost had to cut the Ariado Authority. If we were still limited to those original faction slots, pretty much nothing we still have planned would be possible, including the re-edition of the Duskin League, and we'd probably have to cut some of the other factions that are currently playable. Luckily, one of the patches bumped this limit up to somewhere around 100 on the Steam version, giving us the ability to do not just more playable factions, but other neat stuff with other faction slots. Even aside from the stability issue with multiple factions, there were limitations that existed for factions which weren't coded in the original faction slots from the game. So the Empire and Rebellion and Empire at War, and then the Zon Consortium called the Underworld and the Code for Forces of Corruption. The biggest limitation here was with story scripting, which is used not just for adding narrative campaign elements or something, but things as basic as allowing you to lock and unlock tech as you progress. These were only able to be assigned through 3 specific hard-coded tags that tied directly into the specific factions. Thanks to the patches though, a new tag was added, allowing you to assign a story plot for any faction you wanted to, alongside a slew of new Lua commands, allowing you to lock and unlock tech arbitrarily for any faction and a bunch of other capabilities. We used this very heavily in Thrawn's Revenge, Fall of the Republic, and Revan's Revenge for mechanics that are done on a per faction basis, like the ship market mechanic for the Corporate Sector Authority. Another category where things are far more flexible in the Steam version is the UI, which the most recent patch gave a lot more ability to interact with. This is actually something, again, we haven't had enough time to do a lot with, but you can do a lot with it that we're starting to play with in a way which simply wasn't possible before at all. We even have whatever this is. Speaking of really powerful stuff we haven't taken as much advantage of yet, is the ability to individually track the same unit between tactical and galactic. We currently have stuff like persistent damage for Super Star Destroyers, for example, but this had to be limited to units which are unique within a given faction, because if there were 2 or more of something, the game had no way to tell which was which. The identifiers for each unit have been exposed to Lua scripting now, though, allowing us to do a lot of things with those kinds of individual units. This is just a small sample of the changes made between Steam and the older GOG and Disk versions, which have made it impossible to keep the same mods available for every version of the game. Again, I know it's disappointing to have to rebuy it if you only own the Disk or GOG version, especially for people who may live in areas where Steam isn't accessible, but at least from our perspective, this is why it's not worthwhile for us to work on all of the different game versions. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more. Hope to see you next time.